On Monday, 5th March 1943, as the desert winds swept across the wreckage of burned-out tanks near the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, General George S. Patton stood among his staff officers surveying a battlefield that had only recently fallen silent. The date marked a turning point in World War II because American forces, bloodied and embarrassed by early defeats, were beginning to recover their footing against a seasoned enemy. Somewhere ahead, retreating through the hills and wadis of North Africa, was the German commander Patton respected more than any other. It was in this context, shaped by study, rivalry, and hard-won experience, that Patton would utter the line later etched into legend, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book." The phrase did not emerge from bravado alone. It reflected years of professional preparation and intellectual engagement that preceded Patton's arrival in combat. Long before World War II erupted, Patton had immersed himself in the study of military history, believing that wars were won by understanding how others had fought before. He read deeply, not only about American and British campaigns, but about German doctrine, tactics, and philosophy. Among the works he studied were writings associated with Erwin Rommel, whose ideas on mobility, initiative, and combined arms warfare shaped German operations in the early years of the war. Rommel's reputation had grown rapidly after the fall of France in 1940 and during the North African campaign that followed. He was portrayed as bold, unconventional, and relentless, a commander who exploited speed and surprise to offset material disadvantages. His approach reflected broader German operational doctrine, but Rommel's personal style gave it distinctive expression. In World War II, reputation mattered, influencing morale, decision-making, and even enemy perceptions. Patton paid close attention to this reputation, not out of admiration for the Nazi cause, but because he understood that knowing an opponent's habits could mean the difference between defeat and victory. The American army that entered World War II was still in transition, expanding rapidly and learning under pressure. Early encounters with German forces exposed weaknesses in training, coordination, and leadership. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, these weaknesses were laid bare as German units under Rommel's overall influence inflicted a sharp defeat on U.S. forces. The shock reverberated through Allied command structures, prompting urgent reassessment. Patton was sent to restore discipline, confidence, and effectiveness, a task he approached with characteristic intensity. Patton's leadership style emphasized order, aggression, and personal accountability. He imposed strict standards, from uniform regulations to battlefield conduct, believing that discipline underpinned combat effectiveness. Yet beneath this surface severity lay a deep appreciation for operational art. He studied maps obsessively, anticipated enemy movements, and prepared contingencies. His respect for Rommel stemmed from this analytical mindset. In World War II, commanders who underestimated their opponents often paid dearly, and Patton was determined not to repeat that mistake. The North African theater offered a unique environment for armored warfare, with open terrain favoring maneuver but harsh conditions taxing men and machines alike. Rommel had exploited these conditions with skill, launching rapid thrusts that disoriented slower opponents. Patton recognized that countering such tactics required anticipation rather than reaction. He trained his units to move aggressively, maintain momentum, and exploit opportunities without waiting for perfect conditions. This philosophy mirrored aspects of German doctrine adapted to American strengths. The famous remark attributed to Patton captures a moment of convergence between theory and practice. By studying Rommel's writings and campaigns, Patton believed he could think like his adversary, predicting likely courses of action. When Allied forces began to blunt German attacks and regain the initiative, Patton interpreted this as confirmation that intellectual preparation mattered. In World War II, the battlefield rewarded commanders who combined courage with comprehension.
It is important to note that the quote itself has been subject to debate among historians. Like many wartime anecdotes, it has been repeated, embellished, and sometimes detached from its precise context. Whether Patton spoke those exact words at that exact moment matters less than what the story represents: a mindset rooted in professional respect and relentless study. In educational terms, the episode illustrates how learning and preparation translate into operational advantage. Patton's relationship with Rommel was entirely indirect. The two never met face to face, yet each influenced the other through action and reaction across the battlefield. Rommel adjusted his tactics in response to Allied capabilities, while Patton refined his approach based on observed German methods. This dynamic interaction exemplifies the adaptive nature of warfare in World War II, where opponents evolved continuously in response to one another. The broader Allied effort in North Africa benefited from this learning curve. British experience, American resources, and shared intelligence combined to counter German advantages. Patton's role was part of this collective adaptation, not an isolated phenomenon. His emphasis on speed, coordination, and decisive action aligned American forces more closely with the demands of modern warfare, as revealed by World War II. Rommel himself faced constraints that shaped his decisions. Chronic shortages of fuel, equipment, and reinforcements limited his operational freedom. While often portrayed as a lone genius, he operated within a complex system influenced by strategic directives and logistical realities. Understanding these constraints was part of Patton's analytical approach. In World War II, recognizing an enemy's limitations was as important as acknowledging their strengths. The Allied victory in North Africa ultimately ended in Allied victory, driven by overwhelming material superiority and improved coordination. Rommel was withdrawn, and German forces surrendered in May 1943. Patton's subsequent campaigns in Sicily and Western Europe further demonstrated his aggressive style and operational confidence. The intellectual habits that led him to study Rommel continued to shape his decisions throughout the war. Educational analysis of this episode underscores the value of professional military education. Patton's reading was not casual, it was systematic and purposeful. He sought patterns, principles, and insights that could be applied under pressure. In World War II, where technology and scale transformed combat, such intellectual grounding helped commanders navigate uncertainty. The story also challenges simplistic narratives that frame warfare solely as a contest of personalities. While Patton and Rommel loom large in popular memory, their actions were embedded in institutional structures, doctrinal traditions, and collective efforts. Appreciating this context deepens understanding of how World War II was fought and why certain approaches proved effective. Patton's remark, real or apocryphal, has endured because it captures an essential truth about competitive learning. Respecting an opponent's skill does not diminish one's own resolve, it sharpens it. In World War II, commanders who approached conflict with curiosity as well as aggression were better positioned to adapt and prevail.
As the war progressed, Patton continued to emphasize preparation and anticipation. His units practiced rapid movement, rehearsed contingencies, and sought to keep the enemy off balance. These methods reflected lessons drawn from studying German operations, including those associated with Rommel. The interplay between study and action remained central to his command philosophy. The legacy of this mindset extends beyond individual battles. Military education after World War II increasingly emphasized the study of enemy doctrine as a core component of training. The experience of commanders like Patton reinforced the idea that understanding potential adversaries was essential to readiness. This approach continues to influence military thinking in the modern era. Rommel's own legacy evolved after the war, shaped by reassessment and myth-making. While his tactical skill is widely acknowledged, historians also examine the limits of his strategic vision and his role within the Nazi system. Patton's respect for Rommel did not imply endorsement of the regime he served, a distinction important for historical accuracy and ethical clarity when discussing World War II. The enduring appeal of the quote lies in its human dimension. It suggests a moment of recognition across enemy lines, grounded in shared professional values rather than ideology. Such moments remind us that warfare, even in a conflict as vast as World War II, is shaped by individuals who think, learn, and respond to one another. Understanding what Patton meant when he acknowledged Rommel requires moving beyond legend to examine preparation, doctrine, and adaptation. It invites reflection on how knowledge becomes power in combat and how studying an enemy can turn admiration into advantage. These themes remain relevant, ensuring that the story continues to invite exploration rather than closure. In the months following North Africa, Patton carried these lessons into the planning and execution of operations in Sicily, where the terrain differed sharply from the open desert, but the intellectual challenge remained the same. He approached the campaign with an awareness that German commanders, many trained in similar doctrines to Rommel, would rely on delaying actions, counterattacks, and exploitation of terrain to offset Allied numerical superiority. In World War II, Patton believed that understanding how German officers were taught to think allowed him to anticipate not only their moves, but the timing and intent behind them. The Sicily campaign revealed how deeply Patton internalized the idea of momentum. German defensive doctrine emphasized elastic defense, trading space for time while inflicting casualties. Patton responded by pushing his units forward relentlessly, often advancing faster than expected and forcing German formations to withdraw before they could establish cohesive defensive lines. This was not recklessness, but calculation, rooted in the belief that hesitation allowed experienced opponents to regain control of the battlefield. The intellectual duel that began in North Africa continued indirectly, shaped by shared assumptions about speed and initiative that defined armored warfare in World War II. Patton's study of German methods also influenced how he viewed command relationships. He understood that Rommel often operated with a degree of autonomy, sometimes stretching or defying higher directives to exploit opportunity. While Patton operated within a different command culture, he sought similar flexibility, encouraging subordinate commanders to act decisively within his intent. This approach reflected an appreciation for Auftragstaktik, the German concept of mission command, adapted to American organizational norms during World War II.
As Allied forces prepared for operations in Western Europe, Patton's reputation grew alongside the myths that surrounded him. He was cast as a bold, almost reckless figure, yet those who worked closely with him observed a commander who spent hours studying intelligence reports, terrain, and enemy doctrine. His respect for Rommel symbolized this duality, combining theatrical aggression with meticulous preparation. In World War II, such a combination proved particularly effective against an enemy whose early successes had been built on similar principles. The Normandy landings in June 1944 brought these ideas into a new phase. Although Patton did not land on D-Day itself, his role in the deception plan known as Operation Fortitude underscored Allied understanding of German expectations.
The Germans believed Patton to be the most aggressive Allied commander, and planners exploited this perception to mislead them about the location of the main invasion. This manipulation of enemy assumptions reflected a deep understanding of how German commanders thought, an understanding shaped in part by studying figures like Rommel throughout World War II. When Patton finally took command of the Third Army in August 1944, his operational style came fully into view. He launched rapid advances across France, exploiting gaps in German lines and maintaining pressure that prevented effective reorganization. These advances echoed the principles he had admired and studied, turning German doctrine against its practitioners. In World War II, the irony was unmistakable. Methods developed by German theorists were now being used to hasten Germany's defeat. German commanders facing Patton recognized the challenge he posed. Intelligence reports noted his speed and unpredictability, qualities once associated with Rommel. This mutual recognition highlights how professional respect in warfare often transcends national boundaries. Patton's acknowledgement of Rommel was part of a broader pattern in which experienced commanders assessed one another not through ideology, but through observed competence on the battlefield. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 further demonstrated Patton's capacity to anticipate German actions. When German forces launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes, Patton rapidly reoriented his army northward, relieving pressure on besieged Allied units. His ability to respond so quickly reflected a mindset trained to expect bold, unconventional moves, a mindset informed by years of studying German operational behavior in World War II. Rommel did not participate in the Ardennes offensive, having been wounded earlier and later implicated indirectly in resistance to Hitler. Yet the operational logic behind the German plan bore traces of the same tradition of decisive maneuver that Patton had long examined. Understanding that tradition allowed Patton to react decisively, reinforcing the idea that intellectual preparation had tangible battlefield consequences. In examining these episodes, historians emphasize that Patton's respect for Rommel was neither sentimental nor isolated. It was part of a systematic approach to command that valued learning from adversaries. Military education institutions after World War II often cited such examples to illustrate the importance of studying enemy doctrine, not merely as an academic exercise, but as a practical necessity for success in combat. The phrase attributed to Patton endures because it encapsulates this philosophy in a vivid human way. It suggests a moment where preparation met reality, where study translated into action under fire. Whether spoken exactly as remembered or shaped by retelling, it reflects a truth about how Patton viewed warfare during World War II, as a contest of minds as much as machines.
As the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, Patton continued to push his forces forward, maintaining pressure until German resistance collapsed. The habits of thought that led him to study Rommel never left him. Even in victory, he analyzed operations, reflected on decisions, and considered what might have been done differently. In this sense, the intellectual rivalry implied by his famous remark remained active, extending beyond the life of any single opponent and shaping how the conflict was understood and taught. In the final months of the European War, Patton's operational tempo remained relentless, even as German resistance fractured into isolated pockets. He viewed the collapsing front not as a signal to slow down, but as an opportunity to prevent any coherent withdrawal or reconstitution of enemy forces. This instinct reflected lessons drawn from studying German campaigns earlier in World War II, where rapid exploitation often turned localized success into strategic collapse. Patton believed that once momentum was achieved, it had to be sustained until the enemy lost not only territory, but the will and capacity to respond. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine and advanced deep into Germany, Patton encountered the material consequences of the war he had spent years analyzing. Destroyed cities, displaced civilians, and exhausted enemy soldiers formed a stark contrast to the abstract doctrines and maps that had occupied his studies. Yet even here, he continued to interpret events through the lens of military thought. He noted where German defenses had stiffened or crumbled, drawing connections to training, leadership, and morale, all factors he associated with the strengths and weaknesses he had long identified in German command culture during World War II. Patton's interactions with captured German officers further reinforced his respect for professional competence, even in defeat. Interrogations and informal conversations revealed a shared vocabulary of tactics and operational principles. Many German officers were surprised by how thoroughly American commanders understood their methods. This mutual recognition underscored the extent to which Patton's pre-war and wartime studies had narrowed the intellectual gap between former adversaries. In World War II, such understanding often meant the difference between costly stalemate and decisive breakthrough. The end of organized resistance in Germany did not bring an end to Patton's reflections. He remained outspoken about military preparedness and the importance of learning from recent experience. His comments, sometimes controversial, were rooted in a belief that the lessons of World War II would shape future conflicts. Central among these lessons was the idea that effective leadership required an appreciation of the enemy's perspective, an idea embodied in his long fascination with Rommel's campaigns and writings. In the post-war period, historians and military educators returned repeatedly to Patton's campaigns as case studies. They emphasized how his aggressive style was balanced by intellectual discipline, challenging simplistic portrayals of him as merely impulsive. His engagement with German doctrine, particularly armored warfare theory, became a focal point in discussions about adaptation and innovation in modern armies. World War II, as taught through these examples, emerged not only as a story of industrial might, but as a contest of ideas tested under extreme conditions.
The figure of Rommel also underwent reassessment in these narratives. Separated from the ideology of the regime he served, his operational skill became a subject of analysis rather than admiration. Patton's respect for him was often cited as evidence that effective commanders recognized competence regardless of nationality. This perspective influenced how World War II was remembered in professional military circles, fostering a more nuanced understanding of the conflict's leading figures. Patton's legacy, shaped in part by his intellectual engagement with his enemies, continued to influence doctrine long after his death. The emphasis on initiative, speed, and understanding adversary doctrine found expression in Cold War planning and training. Military manuals and war colleges drew on examples from his campaigns to illustrate principles that transcended the specific circumstances of World War II. In this broader context, the famous remark attributed to Patton functions as a symbolic anchor rather than a literal transcript. It represents a moment when preparation, respect for the enemy, and decisive action converged. The endurance of the phrase speaks to its ability to convey complex ideas in a single image, capturing how one commander internalized the lessons of World War II and applied them under the pressure of combat. As generations removed from the conflict continue to study its battles, the relationship between Patton's study of Rommel and his own battlefield success remains a compelling example of applied military education. It reminds scholars and practitioners alike that victory in war often depends as much on understanding as on force. In World War II, this understanding was forged through careful study, hard experience, and a willingness to learn even from those who stood on the opposite side of history.